Rain doesn't ask permission before it falls. It simply opens its hands and lets go of everything it's been holding. I think about that now, the way certain things just release, not because the moment is right, but because the weight finally becomes unbearable. That's how Stephen Kirk left. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony. He left the way rain falls, all at once and without warning. I didn't know any of this the morning I first saw him. I was standing in the corridor of Hartwell Residential Suites, wrestling with a box that was at least 2 sizes too large for my arms, when the elevator doors slid open and a man walked out carrying nothing but a single duffel bag, and the kind of expression that belongs to someone who has recently survived something they don't yet have words for. He was tall. That was the first thing my body registered before my brain had a chance to catch up. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that looked less like a style choice and more like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His jaw was sharp. His eyes were the color of deep water. That particular shade of gray-blue that you only find far from shore. And he was looking at the corridor numbers with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to trust anything to memory. He found his door. He slid his keycard in. He disappeared inside. I stood there in the corridor with my box of books and the distinct, unsettling sensation that something had just happened to me, though I couldn't yet name what it was. My name is Archie Fisher. I am, as my designation has always made abundantly clear to the people around me, an Omega. 26 years old, assistant archivist at the Hartwell City Heritage Library, owner of approximately 437 books and one deeply unreliable houseplant named Bernard. I am, by all reasonable measures, a person who has his life arranged into orderly systems, labeled boxes, color-coded shelves, predictable routines that hold the world at a manageable distance. I was not, in any version of my carefully maintained life, prepared for Stephen Kirk. He knocked on my door 3 days later. I was in the middle of reorganizing my secondary bookshelf, the one dedicated to 20th century correspondence and epistolary literature, when the knock came. 3 sharp, unhesitating raps. The knock of someone who has decided to do something and is not second-guessing it. I opened the door in my reading socks, with a copy of a collected letters volume tucked under my arm and my glasses slightly crooked, because of course I did. He was standing there in a gray thermal shirt and dark trousers, holding a small potted plant. The plant appeared to be a succulent, and it was already thriving in a way that suggested someone had been caring for it with consistent attention. "I've been told," he said, his voice carrying the low, measured weight of someone who chooses words the way other people choose which bridge to cross, that it's customary to bring something when you're introducing yourself to a neighbor. I stared at the plant, then at him, then at the plant again. "That's," I said, with the breathtaking eloquence that my university degree had clearly prepared me for, "a succulent." "It is," he agreed, with what I would later come to recognize as his particular brand of dry patience. "It's harder to kill than most things. I thought that was practical." "I've managed to kill a cactus," I said. "2, actually." He considered this. He did not look deterred. "Then, this is a challenge." And that was how I met Stephen Kirk, on my doorstep, with a succulent between us and the particular quality of late afternoon light that makes ordinary moments look, in retrospect, like the beginning of something. "Archie Fisher," I said, and offered my hand. "Stephen Kirk." His grip was warm and firm and lasted precisely the right amount of time. I named the succulent Gerald. He is currently thriving on my windowsill next to Bernard, who has rallied somewhat since gaining a companion, and I think about that sometimes, about how the right presence can change the conditions for survival. The thing about living in a residential suite building is that proximity creates its own kind of intimacy before you've decided whether you want it to. You share elevators, you hear each other's morning alarms through thin walls. You run into each other at the coffee machine in the lobby at hours that neither of you has fully committed to being awake. Stephen was always awake before I was. This I discovered on the 4th morning after he moved in, when I descended to the lobby at 7:15 in my coat and scarf, expecting the machine to myself, and found him already there with 2 cups. He passed one to me without being asked. It was the right temperature. It had the right amount of milk. I don't know how he knew. I didn't ask. There are things you learn about a person in proximity that they never have to tell you. That Stephen woke early and moved quietly. That he read on the building's small rooftop terrace when the weather permitted, always with a physical book and never with his phone. That he sometimes stood at the window of his suite for long stretches in the evening. I could see the rectangle of warm light from my own window across the courtyard. Not restlessly, but the way a person stands when they are waiting for something inside themselves to settle. That he had come here from somewhere else, not just geographically, though he had, I would piece together gradually, from very far away, but from some other version of his life that he was no longer inhabiting. I was curious about him in a way that frightened me a little, because I am not, by nature, a curious person. I am a careful person. There is a difference. Careful people do not poke at things that might poke back. Curious people cannot help themselves. With Stephen, I could not help myself. It was a rainy Saturday, the 3rd week of his residence, when it shifted from polite neighborly exchange to something more honest. I'd been in the lobby reading, because the radiator in my suite had decided that afternoon was the appropriate time to begin making a sound like a small animal in distress, and the lobby was quiet and warm. Stephen came in from outside shaking water from his jacket, saw me tucked into the armchair by the window, and stopped. "You're always reading," he observed. "I work in an archive," I said. "It's a vocational hazard." He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen a full smile from him, and it rearranged something in my chest in a way I wasn't entirely prepared for. It changed his whole face, cracked the careful composure open, and let something warmer through. "Can I sit?" He gestured to the sofa adjacent to the armchair. "It's a communal lobby," I said. "You don't have to ask." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway." He sat. For a few minutes we were quiet in the way of 2 people who are discovering, with some surprise, that the silence between them is comfortable rather than pressured. Outside, the rain increased its ambitions. "What are you reading?" he asked eventually. I held up the cover. It was a collection of 20th century explorers' personal journals, the kind that document not the official record of expeditions, but the private emotional terrain, the homesickness, the doubt, the particular loneliness of being somewhere magnificent and having no one to tell. Something moved across his face. Quick, but I caught it. "That's a specific kind of reading," he said. "I find it useful," I said, "to remember that even people doing extraordinary things feel ordinary amounts of loneliness." He looked at me then with a directness that made me want to look away, and also made it impossible to. "That is a very honest thing to say to someone you've known for 3 weeks. You handed me coffee at 7 in the morning without being asked," I said. "I think we're past pretending." He laughed. It was quiet and genuine, and surprised him, I think, as much as it surprised me. And after that, we talked, really talked, for the first time. Not about where he'd come from, not yet, but about other things, books and what they're for. The peculiar institution of the archive, what it means to preserve things that other people have decided to leave behind. He told me he was a structural engineer, that he'd spent the last several years working on large infrastructure projects, that his work had taken him to many places, and that each place had required him to become a slightly different version of himself, and that somewhere in that process he had misplaced something he was still looking for. He didn't say it quite like that. He said it in pieces, over the course of 2 hours, with the careful incrementalism of someone who is unused to being listened to with full attention. I listened. I am good at listening. It is perhaps the skill my life has most thoroughly developed in me. The ability to be still and present and receptive, to let things come to me rather than grasping for them. By the time the rain slowed to a murmur, we had been talking for nearly 3 hours. The lobby was dim and warm around us. The evening had deepened without either of us noticing. "I should go up," he said finally, but didn't move immediately. "You should," I agreed, and also didn't move. We looked at each other for a moment in the amber lobby light, and something unnamed and unhurried passed between us, the way weather moves across a landscape, present and undeniable, but not yet arrived. Good night, Archie. Good night, Stephen. Winter was beginning to make its intentions clear. Mornings with frost on the courtyard tiles, evenings that arrived before you'd finished afternoon. When Stephen told me he'd left his country. We were in my suite by then, which had become a natural thing over the preceding weeks. He came over in the evenings sometimes, or I went to his, and we occupied each other's spaces with the ease of people who have decided, without quite discussing it, that each other's company is where they prefer to be. He brought his books. I brewed tea. We read and talked, and occasionally didn't do either, just existed in parallel with the comfortable ease of people who had known each other far longer than the calendar suggested. He'd told me small things, that his parents were gone, his mother years ago, his father more recently, that he had no siblings, that his work had been his whole life for a long time, and that this had seemed like a reasonable trade until, suddenly, it hadn't. What he hadn't told me was why here. Why this city, this building, this particular corridor. He told me on a Thursday evening when the frost was new and the windows of my suite were misted with warmth. We were on my sofa with tea cooling on the table between us, and he'd been quieter than usual. A different quality of quiet. The kind that is building towards something rather than resting in contentment. I left everything, he said, without preamble. Not gradually, all at once. I waited. My job, my flat, my kale. He paused, chose a word carefully. Context. The whole architecture of my life there. I left it. Why? I asked. Because he had paused as if waiting for the question, and because I wanted to understand rather than simply receive the information. He turned his head and looked at me directly, because I had spent 8 years building a life that looked exactly the way a life is supposed to look. Successful, structured, purposeful. And one morning I woke up, and the whole thing felt like a building I was maintaining but not living in. I understood this more than I said. I understood it in my body, actually, the way certain truths land in the chest before the brain has finished processing them. And Alpha walking away from everything, I said quietly, not as commentary, just acknowledgement of the enormity of it. Society has particular expectations of alphas, provision, stability, forward momentum. Leaving is supposed to be the Omega's prerogative, the soft retreat. An alpha dismantling his entire life and walking away from it cuts against every narrative we're handed. Yes, he said. His jaw was set in that particular way I'd come to recognize as him holding something steady through effort. I know what it looks like. It looks brave, I said. To me. He looked at me for a long moment. Something in him shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, to anyone who didn't know the particular landscape of his silences. But I knew it, in the way you know weather before it arrives. I didn't feel brave, he said. I felt like I'd run out of other options. That's usually when courage shows up, I said, when everything else has left the room. He reached across then and put his hand over mine where it rested on the sofa cushion. Warm and certain, not a romantic gesture yet, or not only that, more like the physical language of two people confirming that they are real to each other. We stayed like that for a while, with the frost on the windows and the tea going cold between us, and the feeling of something that had been cautiously approaching for weeks, finally settling into the room to stay. I should talk about what it means to be an Omega, because this story would be incomplete without it, and because I've spent enough of my life letting other people's assumptions fill the space where honesty should live. Being an Omega, in my experience, means spending a great deal of your life being perceived as one thing while being another. Soft, people assume. Passive. In need of direction and structure and the confident orbit of an alpha to give your life shape. The archetype is deeply embedded, even in people who consider themselves progressive. That fundamental picture of the Omega as the one who receives, who responds, who waits. I am not passive, I am careful. There is still that difference. I am also, beneath the careful organization and the quietly maintained distance, someone who feels things with a depth and precision that occasionally alarms me. I feel the specific texture of certain music in my sternum. I feel the grief of library books that haven't been borrowed in decades. I feel the exact quality of morning light through fog as a kind of tenderness directed at the world. I am not a person who feels less than others. I am a person who has learned to keep most of it below the surface, because the surface is where people look when they're deciding what category you belong to. Stephen looked below the surface, from very early on. This was what frightened me, and what drew me simultaneously, because you cannot have one without the other. The thing that makes someone feel safe is exactly the thing that makes them dangerous to the carefully maintained distance. He saw me reading and asked not what I was reading but why. He heard me mention my job and asked not what the job entailed but what it meant to me. When I talked about my flat and my books and my solitary routines, he didn't look at me with that particular blend of pity and gentleness that people use when they've decided your life is a small one. He looked at me with something more like recognition, which meant that by the time his hand covered mine on the sofa cushion that Thursday evening, I was already, quietly and without drama, entirely undone. The first time he kissed me was 2 weeks after that evening. I mention this not because the timeline is important in itself, but because the 2 weeks between contain everything that made it mean what it meant. 2 weeks of walking together on weekend mornings, because he'd asked and I'd said yes. 2 weeks of him waiting for me in the lobby with coffee at 7:15 without my having asked. 2 weeks of evenings in each other's company where the books got less reading time than the conversation where we stayed up past reasonable hours because neither of us was willing to be the one who said goodnight. And where the silences between the talking had become so comfortable that they were their own form of communication. 2 weeks of the particular, exquisite tension of two people who both know something is happening and are, for different reasons, moving toward it slowly. I was at the kitchen counter in his suite, washing up the mugs from our tea, when I realized he'd gone quiet. Not his comfortable quiet, a different quality entirely. I turned around. He was leaning against the counter on the other side of the small kitchen, arms crossed loosely, watching me with an expression I'd seen before in very different contexts. The look of someone who has made a decision and is watching for the right moment. "You're staring," I said. "I am," he agreed. He didn't look remotely apologetic. "Should I ask why?" "You can," he said, "or you can let me come over there instead." My heart did something that I would describe, if I were cataloging it for an archive, as significant irregular activity. "Those aren't mutually exclusive options," I said, which was the most composed response I could manage. He crossed the kitchen. He was unhurried about it, the way he was unhurried about most things, deliberate, present, not performing the approach, but simply making it. He stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head back slightly to look at him, and he looked at me with that dark water expression. That gray-blue steadiness that I had come to understand meant he was entirely certain of what he was doing. "Archie," he said, and the way he said my name, quiet and precise, like something he'd been carrying carefully, made everything inside me still. "Stephen," I said back. And then he kissed me. Gently, at first, a question being asked before it became a statement. His hand came up and curved along my jaw with a tenderness that was entirely at odds with his size and the general impression of solidity he gave the world. And I understood in that moment what people mean when they talk about being held without being contained. I kissed him back. I kissed him back the way I have learned to do everything that matters to me, with my whole attention, without reservation, with every carefully maintained barrier quietly set aside. When we broke apart, we were both still for a moment. "I've been wanting to do that," he said, "for quite some time." "I know," I said. He smiled. That full, face-rearranging smile that I had been hoarding in my memory since the first time I'd seen it. "You knew." "I pay attention," I said. "It's professionally ingrained." He laughed and pulled me toward him, and I pressed my face against his chest and felt his laugh in my cheekbone and thought, This is the word for whatever is happening. I didn't need to look it up. I'd been archiving it for weeks. Love, when it arrives properly, is not the dramatic lightning strike that stories promise. It is, in my experience, closer to the slow rising of water. So gradual you don't notice how high it's gotten until you're completely surrounded by it, and there is no dry ground left that isn't shaped by its presence. The weeks after the kiss in his kitchen were the rising of that water. Each day added something new to the depth of it. The first time he stayed over, not urgently, not hungrily, just the natural extension of an evening that neither of us wanted to interrupt with the ritual of good night. Waking beside him in the morning, his arm a warm weight across my back, and the particular quality of early light through my curtains, and the sense that the world had quietly, substantially rearranged itself around a new axis. The first time I took his hand in public in the market on a Saturday morning, not as a declaration, but as a reflex, reaching for him without thinking, because he was there and my hand knew where it wanted to be. The first time we argued, which was over something entirely inconsequential, the structural soundness of my filing system of all things, which he had offered to help me overhaul, and I had declined with more sharpness than the situation warranted, and the discovery that we could argue and come back together, that the fabric of what we were building was strong enough to accommodate the ordinary friction of two people with opinions. He was, as a partner, different from what I had always, half-consciously, assumed an alpha would be. He was not dominant in the way that word is usually deployed, not directive, not presumptuous, not operating on the assumption that his preferences were the default. He was, instead, present, thoroughly, warmly, almost uncomfortably present. He paid attention to me with a consistency and precision that took some getting used to, because I am not accustomed to being the object of anyone's undivided attention for extended periods. He noticed when I was tired before I said so. He noticed when I was processing something difficult and needed to be left to the processing rather than prompted. He noticed what music I put on when I was happy versus when I was sad, and he respected both. He noticed. And this was the detail that finally broke something irreversible open in me, that I always put my books back in exactly the right place after reading. And he understood intuitively that this was not fussiness, but the way I maintained a sense of order in my interior world, and he never once moved them without asking. To be known that specifically is a particular kind of vulnerability. There is no armor against it. You either let it in, or you spend enormous energy pretending you're not letting it in, which eventually exhausts you into the same result. I let it in. There was a night in the middle of winter, deep cold outside, the city muffled under the weight of it, when we were lying in his bed and he was talking quietly about his life before. This happened in gradual increments, like sedimentary layers revealing themselves as you dig. Each conversation adding a stratum of before to my understanding of who he was and where he'd come from. He told me about the project he'd been leading, a massive undertaking. Infrastructure at a scale that required not just technical mastery, but the management of teams across multiple sites, the navigation of institutional politics, the maintenance of performance under conditions of sustained pressure. He'd been good at it, exceptional, by the metrics that mattered to the people measuring. But you stopped, I said. I had a conversation with someone I respected, he said. An older colleague. He'd done 35 years in the industry. We were having dinner after a particularly brutal project review, and I was explaining, coherently, professionally, why the setback was manageable and what the recovery plan was, and he looked at me and said, "You know what you've never talked about in all the time I've known you? What you actually want." The dark was quiet around us. His voice was low and steady. I went home that night and I tried to answer the question, and I couldn't. Not because I didn't have preferences. I had plenty of preferences about work, about methods, about outcomes, but when I tried to find the thing I wanted that wasn't instrumentally connected to the work, that wasn't about the project or the role or the professional identity. He paused. There was nothing. Or if there was something, it had been there so long without being fed that I couldn't find it anymore. I was quiet, letting it settle. Then, what did you do? I finished the project. Properly. I'm not the kind of person who abandons a responsibility midway through. Then I handed in my notice, liquidated my flat, and bought a one-way train ticket. To here. To the first place the ticket took me, he said, which was here. I turned my head to look at him in the dim. He was looking at the ceiling, his profile in the faint light from the window, and there was something in his expression that I recognized. Not sadness exactly, but the particular quality of peace that comes after a long period of difficulty, the feeling of having arrived somewhere after a journey you weren't sure you'd survive. "Do you regret it?" I asked. He turned and looked at me. "No," he said. "I did, for the first few weeks. It felt like I'd jumped off something with no idea whether there was ground below. But then, his hand found mine under the duvet. Then I met a man in the corridor who couldn't carry his own box and had somehow managed to kill 2 separate cacti." "The box was very large," I said. "It was," he agreed seriously. "Extremely large. I watched you struggling with it from the elevator and I thought, now there's a person who knows what they need." I laughed, and he turned fully toward me. And in the winter dark of his bedroom, we were close and warm and real. And I thought about arrivals, about how sometimes you don't know where you're going until you're already there and the destination turns out to be a person rather than a place. Spring came. The frost left the courtyard tiles. The rooftop terrace reopened its possibilities, and Stephen returned to his habit of reading up there, except now I was usually there too with my own book and my tea, and Gerald the succulent, who had become a seasonal traveler between my windowsill and the terrace. We had, by now, a life. This was the realization that arrived one morning while I was watching him make coffee in my kitchen, moving through the space with the ease of someone who has memorized it, reaching for my mugs in the right cabinet, knowing where I kept the milk, turning the heat down to the precise level that my ancient temperamental stove requires. We had a life. It had assembled itself around us while we were busy simply being in each other's presence, and now here it was, solid and warm and specific, the way all real things are specific. Not the vague abstraction of companionship, but this particular companionship, with its particular textures and routines and private languages. He called me Fisher when he was teasing me. He called me Archie when he was serious. On a few particular occasions, quiet and close and significant, he called me just Arch, one syllable, soft and brief. And those were the moments that felt most like being held by someone who understood the whole of me and had decided to stay. I called him Stephen because his name felt exact in my mouth, and I didn't want to reduce it. We had not talked about the future explicitly. This was not avoidance. It was more that the future seemed to be building itself without our needing to manage it, and we were, both of us, people who had learned to be suspicious of forcing things. What we had felt organic, alive, the kind of thing that bruises if you grip it too hard, but the future, as it tends to do, arrived on its own schedule. He told me on a Sunday, the kind of Sunday that puts its whole effort into being gentle, soft light, quiet streets, the smell of rain still in the air from the night before. We'd been at the market and then walking and then back at his suite with food we'd collected without much of a plan, and we were eating at his small table by the window when his phone lit up with a message and he went still in the particular way that means something has arrived that changes the landscape. I watched him read it. I watched his face go carefully neutral, not blank, but controlled, the way he goes when he's processing something significant and hasn't yet decided how to carry it. "What is it?" I asked. Not demanding, quietly. He put the phone face down on the table and looked at me. "It's the firm," he said, "my old firm back home." I waited. "They've offered me a position," he said, "a significant one. A project He paused. "It's the kind of project I spent 10 years working toward, the kind of project that doesn't come around twice." The Sunday went on being gentle outside the window. I was very still inside, not cold, not shuttered, closed the way I might have been a year ago, but still, the way water goes still when something large moves through it. "Tell me about it," I said. So he told me. And I listened, because he is someone I love and I wanted to understand the thing that was pulling on him, even as it was pulling on the thing that lived between us. It was a project of real scale and significance, the kind that marks a career, the kind that he had devoted himself to being capable of for years before he'd walked away from all of it. It would require him to go back, not briefly, for the foreseeable future. When he finished talking, we were quiet for a while. When do they need an answer? I asked. 2 weeks, I nodded. I looked at my hands on the table. I thought about Winter and the kitchen and his hand over mine on the sofa cushion and Gerald the succulent and every increment of the life we'd built between us. What do you want to do? I asked. I don't know, he said. And then, after a pause that cost him something, I know I don't want to lose this. I looked up at him. His face was open in a way I'd learned to recognize as his version of vulnerable, not the performed openness of someone seeking reassurance, but the stripped-back honesty of someone who has decided not to protect themselves. I'm not going anywhere, I said. Whatever you decide, I want to be honest with you about that. If you go, it will be hard, and I'll miss you in a way that I'll feel in my bones every day. But I'm not going to tell you not to go, and I'm not going to pretend that a relationship that started because you left everything can only survive if you stay. He was looking at me with an intensity that made the air feel charged. Archie, you left something enormous to come here, I said. I know what that cost you. I'm not going to be another thing you have to leave something enormous to be with. That's not what I want to be. What do you want to be? He asked, very quietly. Yours, I said. However that looks, across whatever distance, for however long it takes. I want to be yours, and I want you to be mine, and everything else is negotiable. The Sunday light was coming through the window at a long angle, warm and unhurried, and Stephen Kirk looked at me across the table with his dark water eyes and said nothing for a long moment. And I watched something in him settle into a decision. I'm going to call them, he said, but I want to tell you something first. Tell me. I didn't come here because of a job or a ticket or a random selection, he said. I came here because I was looking for something and I didn't know what it was yet, and I found it. I found it in a man in a corridor with a box he couldn't carry, and I'm not. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him something. I'm not willing to go back to a life where this doesn't exist in the center of it. Whatever I do professionally, whatever project, whatever country, whatever scale, this is the center. You are the center. I looked at him. I was not going to cry in the middle of his Sunday-like kitchen. I was absolutely not going to do that. I did it anyway, just briefly. Just one traitorous moment of the carefully maintained surface giving way under pressure. He came around the table and pulled me up and held me, and I pressed my face against his collarbone and breathed him in and thought about what it means to be chosen. Not because you're convenient, not because you're present, not because you're what someone has defaulted to, but because you are specifically, deliberately, unambiguously, the thing someone has decided they cannot build a life without. He made the call. He told them he was interested, under conditions. The conditions were mine in the sense that they were built around the fact of me, the necessity of maintaining a home here, of returning with regularity. Of the kind of sustained connection that doesn't allow for the convenient fiction that distance can simply be ignored and feelings can be put on hold. They were, as it happened, amenable. The project was valuable enough that they were prepared to accommodate the requirements of someone whose skills were not easily replaced. He told me all this on the Monday evening. He sat across from me at my kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and laid it out the way he lays out everything, clearly, completely, without editorializing. I leave in 6 weeks, he said. Okay, I said. I'll be back within the month after that, for a week, and then again the month after. It won't be easy. I know that. I know that too, I said. But I need you to know. He leaned forward slightly and his eyes were serious and certain. This is not me leaving you. This is me working with you from a different location. I need that distinction to be clear. It's clear, I said, because I've left things before, he said, and I know what that feels like from the inside, and this is different. This is the opposite of leaving. I'm going somewhere knowing that what I'm going back to here is the reason I can survive going there. I reached across the table and took his hand. Stephen. Yes. I know, I said. I know the difference. I've known you for 8 months now. I know what you look like when you're leaving something, and I know what you look like when you're holding something. You're holding this. His hand tightened around mine. Yes, he said, I am. 6 weeks is both very long and very short, depending on what you're counting toward. We used the 6 weeks. We used them deliberately, filling them with the things that constitute a life, rather than saving them for the sweeping gestures of departure. We used them for Sunday markets and Tuesday evenings and the rooftop terrace in the growing warmth of spring. We used them for conversations that went past midnight and mornings when neither of us was in any particular hurry to start the day. We used them for the steady accumulation of ordinary things, the shared jokes, the recurring arguments about whose bookshelves were better organized, mine objectively. The particular look he gave me when I fell asleep in the middle of reading and woke to find him still there, quiet and present in the amber lamplight. He was the first alpha I had loved, and I was learning, through him, to revise everything I'd been handed about what that meant. Not the assumption of control. Not the instinct to structure another person's life according to his own preferences. Instead, a deep and specific kind of care. The kind that pays attention, that adjusts, that does not require you to be smaller or simpler or more accommodating than you are. The kind that says, I see you, specifically you, and this is what I'm choosing. And I was, I suppose, revising his assumptions in return. Because I know what omegas are supposed to want, the protection, the structure, the settled certainty of an alpha's orbit, and I have never fit that picture particularly well. What I want is simpler and more specific. To be known, to be chosen not because I'm available, but because I'm me. To love someone not because they make me feel safe in the way of walls, but in the way of open water, vast and responsive and alive. Stephen Kirk made me feel like open water, like I could be the full depth of myself, and there was enough room for all of it. On the last evening before he left, we didn't do anything special. This was a deliberate choice, arrived at by mutual and unspoken agreement in the way that many of our understandings arrived. Without negotiation, just the quiet synchrony of two people who have learned each other's rhythms. We made dinner in my kitchen. He made the main course, because he is, frustratingly, a better cook than I am, and I made dessert, which involved an amount of chocolate that he commented on once and then wisely left alone. We ate at my table with the window open to the spring evening and music playing low in the background, and we talked about everything except the morning. After dinner, we went to the rooftop. The city was bright below us, and the sky above was the particular deep blue that comes before full dark, still holding the last memory of the sun. We sat close together on the bench up there, his arm around my shoulders, my head tipped toward him, Gerald the succulent on the ledge nearby making his silent contribution to the scene. I'll call you when I land, he said. I know, I said, and I'll be back before you've had time to miss me properly. I'll have missed you properly by the second day, I said, and I wasn't being dramatic, it was simply true. He pressed his lips to the top of my head. I know, he said quietly. I'll miss you that way too. We stayed on the rooftop until the blue went all the way to dark and the city was fully lit below us, and the spring air had turned to the cool of full evening. And then we went inside and we lay in the dark of his suite, which still smelled like him, which I had already noted with the particular attention of someone archiving something. And we held on to each other in the easy, whole-bodied way of two people who are not afraid of the morning, but are not in any hurry to get there either. He left at 6. I was awake. We didn't make a ceremony of it. A long embrace at the door, his hand against my face for a moment, his thumb tracing my cheekbone with a tenderness that I will remember specifically and forever. Fisher, he said. Kirk, I said back. And then he was gone down the corridor with his bag on his shoulder, and the elevator doors closed, and I stood in my doorway and listened to the building settle around me in the early morning quiet. I went back inside, made coffee, stood at the window and looked at Gerald and the dormant rectangle of warmth across the courtyard where his lights were off now. Then I opened my journal, which is not something I show anyone, and I wrote, he left and he didn't leave. I can feel the difference. It is, somehow, the most remarkable thing. Distance has a texture. This was something I had known abstractly, archived as it were, in the journals of explorers and the letters of the separated, but had not known in my own body until Stephen was 12 time zones away and the world had a new quality of absence in it. He called when he landed. It was the middle of the night for me and he knew it, but he'd said he would call, and so he did. His voice came through the phone warm and certain and slightly exhausted from travel, and hearing it rearranged the absence into something more manageable, not gone, but differently present. "How was it?" I asked. "Long," he said, "but I'm here. Tell me something from today." So I told him, something small, something specific, the way a particular student had come into the archive that morning, looking for a letter written by a great-great-grandparent, and the particular quality of their face when they found it. The way history becomes personal at the exact moment you recognize your own name in it. He listened. I could feel him listening across 12 time zones, as clearly as I could feel him in the same room. "You love that," he said when I'd finished. "What?" "The moment when something stops being history and becomes someone's. You love it." "Yes," I said, "I do." "Good," he said, and I could hear the tiredness in his voice, and underneath it, warm and steady, the other thing. The thing that was not tired at all. "Go back to sleep, Archie. I'll call you when I wake up." "Okay," I said. "Stephen, yes, I'm glad you landed safely." "So am I," he said, "particularly now." The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, as sustained separations do. We found the cadence of us across the distance. The morning calls that were his evening, and vice versa. The messages throughout our respective days that were sometimes substantive and sometimes just the small transmissions of a life in progress. A photograph of something that caught his eye. A voice note from me reading him a particularly good sentence from whatever I was archiving. Evidence, constant and accumulated, that we were each still here, still present in the ongoing life of the other. He was working hard. I could hear it in the quality of his tiredness on the calls. Not the depletion of someone who has been drained, but the productive fatigue of someone spending themselves on something worthy. The project was absorbing him in the way he described his best work doing. Total, demanding, specific. He spoke about it with the technical fluency that I had learned to follow, if not fully understand, and underneath the technical detail, I could always hear the genuine engagement. The pleasure of a mind doing the thing it was built for. "You're happy," I said to him about 3 weeks in. He paused on his end of the call. "Yes," he said, and I could hear him sitting with the word, testing it. "I am. I'd forgotten what this felt like, the work, when it's real." "I'm glad," I said. "Are you?" A careful question. Not testing me, but checking. "Genuinely," I said. "You came here missing something. I watched you looking for it. I'm glad you found it, even if the finding took you somewhere else for a while." "Archie," he said, in the voice he uses when I've said something that gets through his composure. "Don't make it into a bigger thing than it is," I said. "I love you. That means I want the whole of you to be well, not just the part of you that's in reach of me." The silence on the line was the good kind. 3 weeks, he said finally. "Then I'm on the flight." "I know," I said. "I have it on my calendar." "You have a calendar entry for my arrival?" "I have a calendar entry for everything that matters," I said. "Don't be flattered. Bernard's watering schedule is also on there." He laughed, full and genuine, coming through the phone like warmth through glass. "I love you," he said. "I know," I said. "I love you too. Now go finish your day." I.e. The 3 weeks went. They went in the way that waiting goes when you are busy enough to keep most of your attention elsewhere. Not fast exactly, but purposeful. I had my own work, which was, as always, absorbing in its particular archival way. There were cataloging projects and a small exhibition I was helping curate, and the ordinary textured days of a life that is not, it turns out, waiting to begin. My life had been full before Stephen Kirk arrived in the corridor, and it was still full now. He had not filled an emptiness. He had extended and deepened something that was already there. This, I think, is the important difference between needing someone and loving them. Need is a hole that requires filling. Love is a presence that adds to what already exists. I needed nothing from Stephen in the hollow sense. I loved him in the expanding sense. And every day of those 3 weeks my capacity for it seemed to quietly increase, the way water rises. He was late. His flight was delayed by 2 hours due to something weather-related, and I stood in my suite knowing this and finding that the knowledge did not make the waiting comfortable, only informed. I knew he was coming. I knew approximately when. I still paced. Gerald observed this without comment. Bernard, who has never recovered his full dignity despite his recent rally, leaned slightly in the direction of the door, as if even the houseplants had their preferences. The buzzer went at 9:20 in the evening. I pressed the door release. I heard the elevator, the corridor, the door. I opened it before he knocked. He was standing there with his bag on his shoulder and jet lag evident in the set of his eyes and a tired, specific private smile that was for me and no one else. And he looked at me for a moment before he did anything else. "Hello, Fisher," he said. "You're late," I said. "Weather." "I know," I said. "Come in." He crossed the threshold, and I closed the door, and he dropped his bag. And then his arms were around me, and mine were around him, and we stayed like that in the small hallway of my suite, not speaking, adjusting back into the physical reality of each other after weeks of voice and text and screen, remembering the specific weight and warmth of this, the way nothing else substitutes for it. His chin was resting on the top of my head. I could feel him breathe. "Hi," he said very quietly. "Hi," I said into his collarbone. We stood there a while longer. Then he pulled back just enough to look at me, and he looked at me with that gray-blue directness that still 8 months into knowing him made me feel slightly like standing at the edge of a very great height, not dangerously, but with that same quality of open space and the recognition of depth. "I missed you," he said. "In my bones, the way you said." "I know," I said. "I felt it from here." He kissed me. Not gently this time, with the intent and the depth of someone who has been waiting for this with considerable patience and has now reached the end of the waiting. I kissed him back with everything I'd been saving, which was, as it turned out, a significant amount. When we came apart, we were both slightly out of breath and considerably more grounded than we'd been a minute prior. "You should sleep," I said. "Probably," he agreed, not moving. "You have jet lag." "I have several things," he said, still not moving. His hands on my waist and his forehead dropped to rest against mine. I laughed. I couldn't help it. He smiled at the sound of it. I felt the smile more than I saw it, a change in the quality of his presence. "Come on," I said. "Bed, sleep, everything else in the morning." We went to bed. We slept, eventually, tangled together in the uncomplicated way of two people for whom the physical presence of each other is not charged territory, but home ground, warm and specific and exactly right. In the morning, he was still there, which is never something I take for granted, and the light was coming through my curtains the way it always does in the morning after rain. And Gerald was on the windowsill, next to Bernard, and Stephen Kirk was in my kitchen, making coffee with the ease of someone who knows where everything is kept. Some things become home before you've decided to call them that. And then one morning you wake up and the word is just already there, settled into the truth of the situation without ceremony or announcement. Home. He had a week. A week before the project called him back again, and we had, without discussing it, decided to spend it in the ordinary way rather than the commemorative one. Doing the things we always did rather than manufacturing significance. Because the significance was already there in the fabric of the ordinary. We walked. We cooked. We spent a full day on the rooftop when the weather was good, reading and talking and not talking. We went to the library. He had never visited my actual workplace, which felt like a significant gap, and I showed him the archive properly. The vaulted room with its ranks of acid-free boxes and its particular smell of preserved paper and the quality of the light that comes through the high windows at this hour of day. He moved through it slowly, looking at everything, not in the distracted way of someone being polite about a place that doesn't interest them, but with the specific attention of someone whose occupation is the structural integrity of things. Noticing how it was organized, how it was maintained, the care that had gone into making it last. "This is where you spend your days," he said. "Most of them," I said. "I understand you better now," he said quietly. "The careful system of everything. The need to preserve it exactly as it is." "It's not." I started, and then stopped, because he was right, actually, and I knew it. "It's not about control," I said, instead of defending it. "It's about knowing that things can be kept, that something you hold carefully enough can persist past the circumstances that created it." He looked at me. "Yes," he said softly, "I know that about you." That's what I meant. We stood together in the archive in the quiet that is specific to places of preservation, and I thought about what it means to be held carefully by another person, to be treated as something worth keeping. Not because you're fragile, I'm not particularly fragile, but because you have value beyond your utility. Because the person holding you has decided that you matter, specifically and permanently, and is willing to organize their life around the preservation of that. Stephen held me carefully. He had from the beginning, in ways I was still, months later, discovering the depth of. He held me the way I hold the archive, with full attention, with a system that was built around my particular needs rather than a generic template, with the understanding that careful holding is not the same as constraint. I took his hand in the archive. His fingers closed around mine immediately, without thought. "I have a question," I said. "Ask it." "When you come back," I said carefully, "when the project is done, what does that look like?" He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, processing. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "The project has a defined end date, 2 years, roughly. After that," he looked at me. "I'd been thinking about what I want after that. And I want this," he said simply, "here, with you. A permanent version of this instead of a periodic version." My heart was doing the irregular activity thing again. "That's a significant statement." "It's an accurate one," he said. "I left my entire life once to find something worth having. I found it. I'm not interested in treating it as a long-distance arrangement indefinitely." I looked at him in the archive light. 2 years is a long time. 2 years is completely manageable, he said, when you know what's at the end of it. I thought about explorers in their journals, noting the coordinates of where they intended to return to, writing down the place they were heading back toward in the margins of every difficult day. Something to count toward. "Okay," I said. "Okay? 2 years," I said. "We can do 2 years." He smiled at me. That full, face-rearranging smile. And in the archive, surrounded by a century of carefully preserved things, I felt the specific solidness of something that is going to last. 2 years, as it turned out, had its own geography. Seasons and rhythms, visits and departures, the accumulated texture of a sustained love maintained across distance with intention and consistency. He came back 5 more times in the first year. For a week, sometimes 10 days. Each time, we picked up with the ease of people who have not been apart in any meaningful sense, because we hadn't, not in the way that matters. The daily exchange of our ordinary lives had continued unbroken through the calls and messages and occasional videos that I replayed in the evenings, more often than I'd admit mine through the ongoing record of the life I was living in the space between his visits. I grew into the distance, somewhat, the way you grow into any sustained condition. Not that it became easy, exactly. The nights before he left were always their own particular weight, and the day after his departure had a quality of resettling that I didn't resist but simply moved through. But I stopped measuring my life by his absence and started measuring it by its own contents, which were, I found, considerable. I was given a promotion in the archive, senior archivist, which meant more autonomy over the acquisitions and a small curatorial role that let me shape the exhibition program. I threw myself into this with the thoroughness that my nature tends toward, and when I told Stephen about it on a call one evening, he made the particular sound he makes when he's proud of me, a quiet, warm, satisfied noise that he doesn't seem aware he makes. "You should have that," he said. "You've been the most qualified person in that building for 2 years." "Stephen," I said. "I'm being factual," he said mildly. "It's my engineering background. I state structural realities. You're being biased, I said. Also possible, he allowed, but both things can be true. He sent flowers to the library the next day, a substantial arrangement that arrived with a card that simply said, Senior Archie. Congratulations, K. My colleagues were delighted in a way that told me they had formed strong opinions about him based on the accumulated evidence of our calls and his visits, and now, the flowers, and those opinions were uniformly favorable. His project was going well, better than projected, which he described with the satisfied restraint of someone who does not crow but who is genuinely pleased. The structure was rising. The thing he'd spent his professional life developing the skills for was being built, and he was building it, and this was exactly as it should be. The second year was harder in some ways and easier in others. Harder because the familiarity of the arrangement had settled and the acute intensity of the early separation had given way to a lower grade, more constant ache. The kind that doesn't spike but hums steadily beneath the ordinary days. Easier because we were both so deeply embedded in our respective lives that the time moved with more purpose, less waiting. He had a difficult period in the spring of the second year, a structural complication that required reworking months of planning, long weeks of high-pressure problem-solving. Calls that came at unusual hours in my time zone because his were the only hours available. I stayed awake for those calls. I made tea and sat in my kitchen in the small hours and listened, and I asked the questions that helped him think out loud. And I did not try to fix what was not mine to fix, but I was present for all of it. You never tell me it's okay, he said one night, late in the difficult period. Because you don't need to be told it's okay, I said. You need someone to think with. That's different. Yes, he said. That's exactly it. There was a long pause on the line and then, I don't know how you know these things. I've been archiving you for over a year, I said. I know your taxonomy. He laughed, which was the first time he'd laughed in several calls, and the sound of it rearranged everything into something more manageable. The complication resolved. The project resumed its trajectory. In the autumn of the second year, he messaged me at an unremarkable Wednesday noon. I was at my desk in the archive, eating lunch over a catalog entry, and the message said simply, date confirmed, 8 months. Home. I sat with the word, home. He'd used it before about here, about my building and my corridor and the rooftop and the flat and me. But this was the first time he'd used it with a date attached, with a certainty about the direction of travel, with the weight of the permanent rather than the periodic. I messaged back, I'll tell Gerald to prepare. His response was a laughing emoji followed by, give Bernard my regards. 8 months. I am not, at heart, a person who marks occasions with grand gestures. I believe in the small and specific. I believe in the everyday made meaningful by attention, rather than the exceptional made meaningful by scale. But when the day came, the day he was due to land, this time finally and completely, with the full contents of his life rather than a bag packed for a week, I found myself doing something unprecedented. I decorated the flat. Not extravagantly, not with the kind of frantic staging that suggests you've been watching too many romantic films, but I put flowers in the kitchen. Real ones, not the florist's arrangement kind, but the market kind, the loose, cheerful ones that come wrapped in brown paper and smell like outside. I moved Gerald to a more prominent position on the windowsill and placed him next to Bernard in a configuration that suggested, to anyone who knew the history, a kind of triumph. I lit the good candles. I made the food he'd told me he'd been craving, a specific dish I've made for him before. Nothing complicated but assembled with care and the knowledge of his particular preferences. And then I waited, not anxiously, quietly. The quiet of someone who has been moving toward something for 2 years and can now see the shape of the arrival from here. The buzzer went at 7:42 in the evening. He was not late this time. I opened the door before he knocked, same as always. He was standing in the corridor with 2 bags this time, considerably more than a week's worth. He looked tired from travel and more at ease than I had ever seen him. The particular settledness of someone who has completed a thing and is now standing in the rightful place. He looked at me and the tired easiness intensified into something else, something specific and undisguised. "Hello," I said. "Hello," he said. "Come in," I said. "You're home." He crossed the threshold and put down the bags and took my face in his hands, both hands cradling it with the specific, recognizing tenderness of someone who has learned the exact topography of the thing they're holding, and looked at me for a long moment before he kissed me, properly, with the full weight of 2 years in it. When he lifted his head, I saw that his eyes were bright in a way they rarely are. "Archie," he said. "Stephen," I said, "I need to tell you something." Tell me." He kept his hands on my face, looking at me with the gray-blue directness that had, from the first time, made me feel the depth of the water. "I left my country for you," he said. Not literally. Not consciously. I didn't know you existed when I bought that ticket. But I left everything I knew because something in me understood that there was something worth finding, and it turned out to be you. You are what all of it was leading to. The leaving, the arriving, the distance, the coming back. All of it. It has been from the moment I walked out of that elevator and you looked at me over a box that was too large for you, inexplicably, exactly right. I looked at him. I looked at him carefully. The way I look at things that matter, with my whole attention, with the archivist's willingness to hold the significance of a thing without reducing it. "Stephen," I said, "yes, I need to tell you something too. Tell me. Tell me." "I have loved you," I said, "since a Thursday evening in winter when you put your hand over mine on a sofa and the world rearranged itself around that fact. I have loved you across 12 time zones and through every week of distance and through every departure from this corridor. I have loved you specifically and deliberately and without reservation, and I intend to continue doing so, in this flat, in this corridor, on this rooftop, for whatever span of time the future is willing to give us." His hands on my face were warm. His expression was the one I will keep, in whatever archive exists for the things that matter most, completely open, completely present, the composed surface entirely given way to the full depth underneath. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay," I agreed. He smiled, that full, face-rearranging, everything becoming warmer smile, and I pressed into it the way you press toward warmth, instinctively and without calculation, because some things your body knows before your mind gets a chance to catch up. Gerald has since been joined by 3 additional succulents, all of them thriving on the kitchen windowsill in a row. Bernard has made a full recovery and is doing very well, thank you for asking. Stephen took the flat across the corridor. His own space, because we are both people who need our particular arrangements and who would cheerfully murder each other's filing systems if we shared a single space indefinitely. But close. A wall and a hallway and 15 steps between our doors, which is exactly the right distance for 2 people who like each other and also like themselves. He is working. A new project local this time, infrastructure in this city, which means he drives past things that are his in a structural sense, which he notices with a quiet pride he doesn't perform, but which I can see in the particular set of his shoulders when he's describing something going well. He has built things. Literal, physical things that will exist in this city after we're both gone, quietly holding up the weight of the ordinary lives lived on and in and over them. I have been promoted again, deputy head of the archive now, which means a degree of institutional responsibility that I manage with the same careful system I bring to everything, and which means that the things I help preserve will continue to be preserved well beyond my tenure. There is satisfaction in that, in contributing to the persistence of things. We have dinner on Wednesdays and Fridays, always. We walk on Sunday mornings, always. We spend Friday evenings on the rooftop when the weather permits, and in his flat when it doesn't, with books and tea and the comfortable parallel occupation of 2 people who are entirely at ease in each other's presence. We argue about his coffee-to-water ratio, which he maintains, and I consider excessive, and about whether my reorganization of the secondary bookshelf last month constitutes improvement or displacement. and about which of us is responsible for replacing the communal corridor light bulb that burned out in February, and these arguments are always evidence of life, of the ordinary daily texture of two people choosing each other repeatedly, not in the grand declarative moment, but in the small continuous increments of every ordinary day. Last Thursday evening, a Thursday, which feels like the right day for things that matter, we were on the rooftop in the warm air of summer. The city was doing what cities do in summer evenings, lit and moving and inhabited, the particular quality of human life in motion that I find, in sufficient quantities, deeply comforting. Stephen had his arm around me, and I was reading only half attending to the book, because the other half of my attention was doing what it always does when he's close, noting the warmth of him, the specific quality of his breathing, the weight of his arm across my shoulders as though it were cataloging something it needed to be sure of. He said, without looking up from his own book, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," I said. He closed his book. He looked at me with his gray-blue steady gaze and the particular expression that means he has thought about something thoroughly and has now arrived at the moment of saying it. "I want to ask you something," he said. I put my book down. I looked at him. He reached into the pocket of his jacket. Unhurriedly, without theatrics, the way he does everything significant, and produced a small ring. Simple, precise, exactly the kind of thing I would choose if I were choosing it myself, which told me he had paid attention in the particular Stephen Kirk way that still all this time later gets through every carefully maintained distance I've ever tried to keep. "Archie Fisher," he said. "I left my country because I was looking for something worth building a life around. I found it. I've been building it every day for 2 years, and now I want to build the permanent version of it, with your full knowledge and consent and participation." I looked at the ring. I looked at him. Outside, the city went on moving and humming, indifferent and beautiful. The rooftop was warm around us. Gerald was on the ledge nearby, thriving. "That was very architecturally phrased," I said. "Occupational habit," he said, with the steadiness of someone who is holding enormous things very carefully. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," I said. "Stephen, yes." He put the ring on my finger with the same care he gives to everything that matters, and then he looked at me, and I looked at him, and the summer evening held us both in its warm, indifferent light. And the thing between us, which had begun in a corridor with a box too large for my arms, and a man walking out of an elevator with the expression of someone who had recently survived something, was complete. Or not complete. Completed things are finished, and this was not finished. This was simply arrived. Arrived and staying. The Alpha left his country. He crossed an ocean and a continent on a one-way ticket and walked out of an elevator into a corridor and handed me a succulent named Gerald on a doorstep and love. The specific, daily, careful, deliberate, chosen kind was the only thing he could count on. It turned out that was exactly enough. It turned out that was everything. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.